All right, our second topic today. We wanted to discuss the state of policing, and not too broadly, but just the context of police and accountability in the context of the Sonya Massey killing in Illinois that happened on July 6th, and we've seen body cam footage now and so forth, and really the concept of whether or not, out from a societal standpoint, we're setting ourselves up for failure in the sense of how any accountability. Like there's lawsuits that are going to be filed about this and everything like that, and the officer himself is being charged with murder and so forth. But the larger apparatus, the apparatus that actually hired him and armed him and so forth, there's very little downside to them if they bring in someone in this case, like the officer who killed Sonya Massey. There's little downside for the people who hired him, who armed him and so forth, if he goes crazy, or if he does something completely out of line and so forth. Sean Grayson, someone discharged from the Army, been on 6 police forces and so forth. So it's really it's a conversation. Obviously, we'll talk about the shooting, but the shooting conversation is being had. But just the conversation of whether or not, like, are we setting ourselves up for failure? Are we setting ourselves up for these outcomes because the nature of the accountability is so far removed from the actors who may be performing these, or the people who are hiring them and empowering them to go out into the communities. So, Tunde, your reaction, I'll take it to you broadly. Your reaction to the shooting, the body cam footage, and also that this officer was here, and this officer, this particular guy, and we are in a system where this is not something that we would look at like, oh man, how in the world could that ever happen? It looks pretty common to see an officer like this at a scene like this, and the unfortunate result.
No, it's I think there's a lot to unpack with stuff like this, because you have the realities that we see on cameras, which can be difficult, unfortunately, like this one was. And it looks, I just call it what it looks to me is a straight murder. It's not even police brutality or anything like that. This guy just looked like he had wanted to kill this lady at some point after he got into her house. And there's been enough discussion about the actual incident that I don't think we need to go over it play by play type of thing. But so that's something on its own. But you said something very interesting, which is, kind of like the situation that gets some of these officers that, we would consider bad apples in a situation with the public. And I think you're right. We often get caught into the kind of chum that the media throws us, which is the incident itself, and because, the need to get eyeballs and all that. But we're not asking questions. Like you said, this guy was on 6 different police forces since 2020, and we're in 2024. So that's not even a full 4 years. Like you said, before being a police officer, he was discharged from the Army in an unceremonious way for bad behavior, and then he had 2 DUIs. So how does he even become a police officer with that kind of history? So I think that's when we talk about, when serious people talk about taking a look at the justice system, mm-hmm. It's not about necessarily just these simplistic ideas of defund the police or all cops are bad. What it is taking a look at the system itself like this and say, well, how is it that this system seems to be almost unique in allowing people who behave negatively towards the public to continue to get moved around? Yeah. And I say almost unique because, and I hate to make this comparison, but the only other one I know of in my lifetime is the Archdiocese. And that's a very, I don't want to go down that road. That's a different conversation. I'm not here to bash Catholic religion or Catholic people or the faith. I'm here to talk about the institution of the church that's covered up pedophilia. And they keep moving around.
Somebody's accused or found to have done something, and they're not out. They're just moved to a different place.
They're just moved around, and they go prey on new kids in a new community. And it seems like law enforcement is kind of doing the same thing. Bad cops aren't removed. They're just kind of allowed to just move around to different precincts in the country and go hurt other people. And I just think, we had a private conversation, James, you're an attorney, I'm a financial advisor. Imagine if you committed fraud or a Ponzi scheme, and then we look and find out you were at 6 different law firms in the last 4 years, and each time you were just let go, and because you did something wrong and no one wanted to talk about it. Or imagine me if I was a Bernie Madoff type of guy, and then you find out I work for 8 different banks. And we have regulators, we have licenses, there's oversight and rules in our industries. And it's interesting. And a third one I forgot was Supreme Court. We've learned don't have ethics either, controlling it. So sorry, there's three. But that's what I'm saying. So we accept as a society, because of the polarized nature of the way these incidences are shown
presented
to us,
or presented.
That so we're not able to come together and just look at it for what it is. Okay, why do we have police officers that are allowed to work? Because most cops don't behave like this. Yeah. And so it's like, it makes the good ones, their job harder. The public has distrust. And then lastly, and I'll kick it back to you. And then guess what? This city where this happened with Miss Massey, unfortunately, the taxpayer is going to be on the hook because they're going to pay out millions of dollars to her family. And, and for what? Right?
Well,
meaning this didn't have to happen. Like, this guy shouldn't have been on the job, period.
Well, and that's the problem is where you just said it, though. It's because the taxpayers are going to be on the hook for this, not the person who hired him or the department that had him in there. Like, anytime you see situations like this where the same problem keeps cropping up over and over again, there's usually a problem with the incentive structure. And so in this instance, the accountability for a bad action doesn't fall on people who are making the decisions that enabled or that led to the bad action. And so because of that, they are completely insulated. Like, there is no, the incentive structure isn't for a hiring person in the police department to say, hey, I better not hire somebody who has issues with high stress decision making, which, this guy had, that this was in his file, that he had, needed to take a high stress decision making class, so if I know that that's going to potentially put my retirement or my pay or the budget that I'm working with in jeopardy, then there's no way I would hire that person. But if all of that stuff is separate and I don't have to worry about any of that stuff, then if I hire this guy, if he does something bad, we'll fire him. This taxpayer will be on the hook. No big deal. No sweat off my back. Then that's how you end up in the situation. So I think it's pretty clear how we end up in a situation. You brought up how these things are always presented in a polarized way or in a way that will lead to polarization. And I do think that's part of the problem. So part of that is just the media presents things in ways that are going to draw eyeballs. Like if we took this show and made it about all cops are bad or people should just listen to the cops, then I'm sure it would get more eyeballs on it because taking those extremes tend to draw more attention to it. But it's really just not that simple. And I look at it like you raise the other, scenarios where people, look at these and, people are in these scenarios where the accountability, like where the church and so forth. But I think that you mentioned it. I want to make this point. I want to emphasize this point. This is the kind of thing that it puts police in a bad light, like in the sense that, like I remember there was a right-wing guy not too long ago that without any real basis said that, oh, well, I don't want to look at a black pilot and wonder, is he qualified or this and that. But, that's just because people talk about DEI. I mean, that's what's going to make me think about it. And if you think about that comment, that guy's saying that, oh, well, just the mention of the fact that they're trying to diversify employment, is going to make him wonder if everybody's qualified or if everybody is suitable for the job that they're in. Now, the mention of DEI doesn't necessarily mean that you're taking people that aren't qualified. That just means you're looking in more places. But setting that part aside, you're looking at something like this, and why wouldn't the public wonder when if they see that the police officers are willing to hire people who have issues with high stress decision making? Wouldn't the public then turn around and say, well, hold on, you see a cop and it's like, well, hold on, is this one of the cops that is well adjusted and handles an admittedly high stress job very well? Or is this one of the guys that's been bouncing around and had, this department, that department and everything like that, and has a problem with high stress decision making? It undermines the public's confidence, or at least part of the public that's willing to open their eyes and look at it, in the police. And so it hurts everybody. The police are there to protect and serve. And they're hiring people who have problems with high stress decision making. Like, that's crazy to me. But again, it's because of the incentive structure that this is happening. It's not to say that every hiring officer is a bad person. It's that the incentives aren't aligned in a way that allow them to do things that put the public interest first. And yeah, that's the unfortunate part of it.
And you're right, and I want to speak to some of that because I think this situation, kind of like the George Floyd murder, they're unique in the sense that these cops themselves just seem like really bad guys. They were in a situation and they decided to kill someone without any need to do that, not self-defense, not anything like that, not even a fog of war thing where they might have thought something different was going on. But that's maybe different than some of the other cases we've seen, like a Breonna Taylor or what happened in Ferguson with Michael Brown. And I'm saying they're different. I'm not taking one away or saying one is superior or inferior to another. What I mean by different is that's where I kind of see your point even more so, where the way the system works in those municipalities put the law enforcement officer and the civilian and the public at a certain place at a certain time, where at some point enough of these encounters happen and it's going to lead to some unfortunate event. So
you build mutual mistrust over periods of time, basically.
Yeah. So the thing like with Breonna Taylor was the concept of a no-knock warrant, right? I mean, when cops are allowed to just bust into somebody's house, unfortunately that night it seems like they busted into the wrong house. So unfortunately, they busted into the guy's house. He started shooting. They shot back because, that's what happens when you shoot at cops, and they hit Breonna Taylor. So both the cop and the civilian were in a position where they were scared for their own safety, but that's not necessarily their fault on the ground at that moment. That's the system that created that situation by allowing cops to do no-knock warrants in certain neighborhoods, because they don't do no-knock warrants in other neighborhoods. That gets into a whole other conversation. But
because a no-knock warrant is the type of situation, or creates the kind of situation where that kind of thing can happen.
That's my point.
So that's why it's not something you would want to do, in normal situations. And so, let's not go too far away.
And the thing with Ferguson was that in 2015, 25, almost a quarter of the budget for the city came from specifically, this was found by the Justice Department, preying on the Black community in Ferguson for revenue. So there were fines and traffic tickets and all that. So apparently there's 21,000, or there was at the time, 21,000 residents of Ferguson. But between a 2-year period, there were 90,000 citations handed out. So again, when you're preying on one portion of the society for revenue for the city, and you're forcing your cops to make all these stops, they're just that heightened amount of stops, 90,000 stops, probably there's going to be a few incidents that don't end up well. So I think that's something that needs to be discussed as well. Is yes, there's some bad apple cops like these two guys that no matter what I included Derek Chauvin with this guy who killed Sonya Massey, but people like that no matter what the system is doing, they'll probably hurt somebody. But I think a lot of the stuff we see too, going back to the system, this is where, again, people, when they say we should look at the justice system, and like we said on the prior discussion about wages, let's be creative. The problem is, for political reasons, certain people in this country and leaders find it advantageous to try and say that if you do anything that stops the police ability to harm people, then those people, like savages, are going to be coming over, your gates and your walls and attacking you. And it's a very potent message, unfortunately, in our society.
Well, there's that, but then there's the flip side where you get messages like defund the police, which is not helpful in terms of addressing these either. And interestingly enough to me, like I look at, instead of defunding police, like we need to find a way to connect when you have these damage awards to something that is related to that needs to go connect to police funding in some way. If you want to, because again, when you have situations where you went beyond the incentives or the lack of accountability in the incentive structure for hiring into actual practices and how that creates these situations that set us up for failure. I'm looking still narrowly at, with why Chauvin is employed there, or why, the guy who killed Sonya Massey is still employed there. And to me, that's where we have to figure out a way where, and again, this isn't to punish police departments. This is ideally looking forward, where it's okay if we hire and or retain people that are loose cannons, or that don't deal well with high stress situations in this admittedly high stress job, then we as a police department are taking a risk with our funding or with the money that we have. Like there has to be, or some other way to attach, there has to be some way to attach accountability. Human beings are complicated, But the way we make decisions a lot of times isn't that complicated. If there is a downside to something, then people think a little bit more on it versus if there's no downside. If there's only, if there's no downside to something, then you're obviously going to spend less time worrying about or be less careful with the decision versus whether there's a downside. So to me, that's the biggest opportunity here. It's not like, again, the conversation of defund the police itself or that slogan, I don't think is helpful. But the idea of looking at police funding and saying, okay, well, if we're going to hire loose cannons and we're going to continue to employ them, that may affect our funding, or that may come out of our funding if we got to do these settlements or we got to pay for insurance for things like this, then I think that will lead to a lot more care in terms of the kinds of people that are being armed with guns and badges by the state and that are allowed to go around on a mission to protect and serve, which in situations like this end up going going awry and end up in a tragic situation where a lady's gets shot and killed after she's the one that called the police because she worried somebody was snooping around her house, So, yeah. How can we not set ourselves up for failure is the question I'm asking. And again, I know that this is going to, these types of things can be presented in ways that are intended to polarize. But if we want to address the problem, which I'm not sure everybody wants to address the problem, but I think enough people want to address the problem, then we have to get to the heart of these types of things.
Yeah, and that's a good point that not everybody wants to address the problem. One of the things that, as you're talking, I'm just thinking, like, one example you could say just to address certain things and update the system would be, maybe let's look at cops that are in like patrolmen that are in high stressful areas, like in inner cities where there's a lot of crime and stuff. You know what? Maybe we should rotate them to different, do a better job rotating people after a year or two to other parts of the community that are calmer, so that, someone isn't in this certain type of emotional and mental place every time they go to work.
Mentality
for like 3 to 5 years, 10 years. And it might, so there's little things. But one of the things, as you said, about how everybody sees this thing, I wanted to bring up before we close this out, we live in a state, and this is where I think the reality meets kind of rhetoric sometimes, because a lot of this kind of bluster and this tough guy attitude from some politicians lands well on certain parts of the public. But when you start scratching under the surface, again, this stuff is kind of weird, like that people want this. And I don't think most people, when they see it, would really want it. But I'm saying weird from the people that always telling us that
weird must be the word of the week.
Yeah. So DeSantis, our governor, Ron DeSantis, who's currently the governor of Florida, in the last few years, starting in 2021, invited police officers who were unhappy in other parts of the country to come to Florida, which is fine. On the surface. Now, it says, I'm reading an article that'll be in the show notes. DeSantis' $13.5 million police program lures officers with violent records to Florida. And he's on purpose invited officers that have a history of either violence or accused issues, just bad conduct, let's say it that way, to come to Florida because he wants to seem like Mr. Law and Order and Mr. Tough Guy in terms of how he runs the state. So I'm going to quote a little bit from the article. However, among 600 officers who moved to Florida and received the bonus or were recruited in the state are a sizable number who either arrived with a range of complaints against them or have since accrued criminal charges. They give an example of a guy who was part of a $160,000 settlement by the NYPD. He moved down to Florida from New York as a police officer. And it says a Palm Beach police spokesperson told the Daily Dot that Melvin, that was the officer's name, who had complaints against him, including abuse of authority and sexually propositioning a teenager, had disclosed his background during the hiring process. So that's what I mean. Like when you scratch under the surface, hold on, this guy disclosed his background when being hired by a Florida precinct, that he tried to solicit sex from a teenager. And we got this guy in the street in Florida after he settled $160,000.
We paid him a bonus. We invited him.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah. So our governor is actively inviting people who have been busted already in other states for things like pedophilia. I'll say if he's trying to bang a teenager, but these are the people that are going to give us Moms for Liberty and all this stuff. So, and this is the sad part. Again,
it's not just inviting them in general. It's inviting them and then saying, "Hey, let me give you a gun and a badge, and you go around in the community and." Someone who was found to abuse authority, and hey, go around and wield your authority, with a bonus, So it's.
And let's ban books at the same time. And that's my point. Like, it's all about this kind of punitive way to look at a society. And this is one example where let's bring in law enforcement officers. They're just going to crack people over the head, and we won't care about it. And again, then things like, unfortunately, what happened to Ms. Massey happen in some of these communities. So, this is why leadership.
And so that's the answer to the question. Like, well, why are we doing this? And I mean, so political reasons clearly, and then other would be the lack of accountability. Because again, if this guy does something, it's not like Ron DeSantis is going to have. It's not. He doesn't have to come out of pocket. It's going to be the taxpayers. It's going to be me and you. Like it's going to be the taxpayers in Florida got to come out of pocket for that. It's not going to be the hiring officer who hired the guy. In fact, they're all getting bonuses. While the taxpayers got to pick up the bill. And so that disconnect is something that I think creates or at least exacerbates this problem. So, but it's one that, again, there are going to be people who don't want to solve the problem. I just think that in this instance, this is a situation where we can outvote them, and we have to outvote them because they're going to want to maintain the status quo as it is. But I don't think there's enough of them. There's enough people that are just decent people that don't believe in abuse of power and so forth, that in a system like ours, we have to outvote those people despite all of their efforts to make us afraid of this and make us afraid of that, because that's basically how they fight against that is, be very afraid, be afraid of this, be afraid of that. And so, but we got to rise above that. Can't be driven by fear, man. So, but no, I think we can close up this topic from here. Our second topic. Thank you for joining us for this. Check out our first topic as well if you haven't already, and then check out our third topic coming up here shortly.